Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Auspicious Elections podcast. Today is Saturday, May 18th, 2019, starting at 10:08 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. And there goes the mouse. And this is the 30th episode of the show. 30 episodes.
30.
We're off to a good start.
Right.
All right. So 30 episodes. How long have you been doing this? For like a year and a half? Is that what that means?
I think no, that's like 2.5
Two and a half years.
Yeah.
Right. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's a while.
All right. Let's see. What are we starting with? So we usually start by reviewing anything we learned in the past month. Did you have anything along those lines?
I'm afraid that I can't think of any right now. I know that you had one, right?
Yeah, I just had one that was interesting. It was recently that was a fun learning experience, and that was I had a dentist appointment the other day because I've been meaning to go back in for over a year now, and I've been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off because I was so busy. But then I realized like it was going to be another few months because now I've got to travel for like a month or so, and if I didn't get it in like now, it would be put off even longer. So I just like scheduled it. I went in, scheduled it for whatever it was. It was like the very next day because somebody had dropped an appointment at some ungodly hour of like 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I woke up super early, only slept for a few hours, went in, got there, got ready. And then as I was sitting there waiting, I threw up the chart and I saw the ascendant like click over to 0 degrees of Cancer. And Mars had just moved into Cancer like that night or that morning or something like that, right?
Right.
So I was starting my appointment. The very beginning of the appointment was, was Mars basically exactly conjunct the ascendant. And we were doing like a deep cleaning on all 4 quadrants, which required them to do shots. So literally as Mars is like rising up over the eastern horizon, I end up with like 6 shots in like different parts of my mouth, which is just excruciatingly painful. And for whatever reason, the like symbolism of the chart for that moment pretty well described what was happening.
Right. Yeah. And I was asleep because it was very early in the morning. And so I wake up to like 2 emails that say pretty much just that, oh my God, Mars is on the ascendant right now. And then, oh my God, so many shots.
Right. And realizing that they're doing something so serious that I couldn't just do like a topical anesthetic, but I had to do like actual shots in my mouth. So that was rough, but I survived it and was probably necessary. It was certainly necessary because if I hadn't done the shots right then, I would have been in for like an hour and a half or something of just like agonizing pain constantly.
Right.
Versus the more acute, sudden pain of, at the very start.
Right. That really worried me though when I got that email. I was like, oh no, Mars is on the ascendant. That's terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so that was not. Obviously, I didn't elect that. I didn't have a choice, though. It's like there was one appointment. If I wanted to do it, then
yeah.
So it's almost good that I wasn't paying attention to the chart ahead of time, although I still probably would have done it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and actually that does remind me of one, although it wasn't something that went through, but it's kind of a similar, kind of required rather than elected thing. So I had originally scheduled, it's another dental thing because that's why it reminded me. I had originally scheduled my own dentist appointment for a filling a while ago. And then I had to reschedule it. And it wasn't only this reason, but one of the things I had noticed at the time was that I had accidentally scheduled it for the day that Saturn was stationing exact, and which is something I wouldn't normally do if I was paying attention.
Right.
So anyway, and then there was some other reason I also needed to reschedule. So I rescheduled. I finally called back the other day, and it's very limited openings, so you just kind of have to go with what's there. And I realize after I take the appointment, I'm like, okay, that's like a decent rising sign. It's the day that Saturn is exactly opposed to Saturn. I mean, the sun is exactly opposed to Saturn. So I like basically just got out of one like super Saturn focused appointment and then rescheduled it for another.
Okay.
So it's one of those things where like the universe is conspiring somehow to have some sort of symbolism going on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's fun. Was there nothing else though that we learned from the past month, electional wise?
Well, there probably was, but there's been so much going on that I can't think of them right now. Because I
Right.
know that towards the end lately, it was like Mars in late Gemini opposing Jupiter. And that's why the elections were getting a little bit iffy. And then Mars has gone into Cancer, and like the great elections this month or near the end of the month. So I think that's part of why we don't have observations right now.
Right. I forgot. It's because all the great elections are later in May.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. All right. Well, why don't we jump into the elections for June then?
Okay, sounds good.
We're recording this earlier than usual because we're both going to Seattle on Wednesday.
Right.
So we've got like a few days left to record this and then get it edited and released.
Yeah, and so normally we do it later in the month and we have more of the month to watch first.
Right.
Yeah.
But it turns out that that's good because the best election of the month is right at the top of the month this time.
It is, yeah. So, and I have a few notes just generally about June before we get to the specific elections. One of them is that speaking of the great elections being at the end of May, it's the reverse in June. So all the best elections are right in the beginning of June. So it's actually nice that we're going to hopefully get this out sooner than usual.
Good.
Yeah, so it's like all the planets in dignity cluster up at the end of May and then still are there in the beginning of June. And then things start going more awry after that. So because of that, the best elections are early June and then late June. So Venus is in its own sign through June 8th, Venus in Taurus. The dignity isn't quite as good later after it moves out of Taurus, although you can make Venus and Jupiter angular at the same time once Venus goes into Gemini. So that's something.
Mm-hmm.
Mercury starts out the month in its own sign of Gemini. So that's another great thing for the beginning of the month. But then already June 4th, partway through the day, it switches to Cancer. And then it's just applying to Mars or with Mars the rest of the month.
Oh, yeah.
Most of the month.
That was the electional thing I learned is I have to book a plane ticket. I had to book plane tickets like right during this time.
Well, we haven't seen how it played out yet, but yes, that is one thing.
Well, it was a funny conundrum, though, when you pretty much have to book, something during a certain time frame.
Right.
You see that it's largely like not a great chart, but then you don't have much of a choice.
Right. It seems like that's more of our observations so far this month.
Right.
Like things that we can't elect.
Things that you can't control. I mean, you can sometimes do the best that you can, but sometimes there's only so much you can do. And sometimes, in my instances, for example, the Mars thing was necessary, like the pain and the symbolism of Mars of literally having an injection like into my mouth was necessary.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So sometimes you just got to do it.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's a whole side note because like it's tough with some of those things because they can represent simply what's happening, but it's still like would make me think, okay, but aren't there better times to do it where it would like go better, you know?
Maybe there's not though. I mean, sometimes you really do have to just like hunker down and deal with it. And sometimes the annoyance of like the bad thing once you get to it is much more mild or much more manageable than you anticipated. Like it doesn't always have to be worst case scenario.
No, it definitely doesn't. I'm definitely coming from the approach of like my body being like more wonky than most people's, and so being more careful about like scheduling things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, so continue on with the overview of June.
Yeah, so Venus, Mercury, both in their own signs at the beginning of the month, but then they both switch pretty soon. So Mercury switches June 4th to Cancer, and then it's just with Mars most of the rest of the month. It's applying for a while to a conjunction, and then is separating after that, but still with Mars till near the end of the month.
And that conjunction is basically when I give my keynote lecture in the UK.
Speaking of other things you can't schedule or elect.
And then I was supposed to fly home the next day, but instead of flying home on a Mars-Mercury conjunction, I decided to just like hang out there for a few days till that passes and fly back on the 20th.
Yeah, so you will get to report back next month how all that went.
Yeah,
because of course,
we'll see if that works.
We talked about, whether you can avoid whatever that symbolizes versus just experiencing it in one place versus the other. But
I'm avoiding it. I'm definitely getting out of whatever it was.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right. So then mid-month is really kind of gnarly election-wise because the Mars-Saturn opposition is exact around mid-month. Mars in Cancer opposing Saturn in Capricorn. And then Mercury's also tied up in that, and it's ruling both the Sun and Venus at that point in Gemini. And so mid-month elections just aren't great. And so that's why you'll see them early and late this month.
Damn it.
What?
I really don't want to be traveling or going to a conference or have to
I know.
speak during this whole pileup.
I know, and it really sucks. And I wish you didn't have to then too. And it's really unfortunate sometimes when things like that, you can't elect at all. I mean, all you can do, like we talked about, is, maybe mess with the time you leave that day or, things like that.
Right.
Or delaying the day you come back, as the case may be. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that they scheduled the conference then. I'm sure there's always reasons, but
I mean, it was probably just one of those annual things.
yeah, it could be.
All right. Well, that's fun. And
So-
that's going to be hard. So do you have elections, or are you just avoiding this in the elections for this month?
Yeah, it's like I had one that looked good other than that, but yeah, I decided to just go with the early and the late. And that's why there's several that are clustered up in the first week, and that's why I threw in 3 more later in the month in case, you can't just do everything you want in the beginning of the month.
I can't remember, but this might be what Austin called the meat grinder.
Yeah, I think it might be. I didn't remember if that was June or July.
Yeah.
That he was referring to, because there's the eclipses then that follow this in July,
Right.
in Cancer and Capricorn, highlighting that same area.
Mm-hmm.
So other things this month, or for June, Neptune stations to go retrograde June 22nd. And then finally, near the end of the month, Mercury slows down because it's going to station retrograde about a week into July. And it's going to station conjunct Mars. So, yeah. So that's the issue at the end of the month, too.
Right. I forgot about
Yeah.
that.
It's not, yeah. It's like, it's close. It's within 3 or 4 degrees near the end of the month.
Right.
Yeah.
What does it retrograde back to? It goes back to 23 Cancer.
I don't recall. I'd have to look.
Yeah, that's what my thing's telling me. Which
Okay.
means, so that means it hits its shadow within days of that whole Mercury Mars stuff.
Mm.
Oh, weird. Actually, right there on the 20th, 19th, or the 19th, actually, the 19th and 20th is when Mercury hits its shadow at 23 Cancer.
Mm. Okay.
Huh. Well, that's interesting. All right.
All right. So, yeah, that's the general overview of the month. So, early June, great. Then things start devolving from there.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the overview. We should say I have gotten like a few questions since our last episode about what to do if you're in a time zone that doesn't fit the election.
Mhm.
So we should probably reiterate that what you try to do with that is usually you can just move, sometimes you can move the date 1 day forward, and as long as the moon is still applying even very widely to some of the same planets, usually benefics, and as long as it's not applying to hard aspects with one of the malefics, if you take it back the previous day with the same rising sign, then usually you're good, and usually you can still use the chart that way. And that's the workaround for people in different time zones where things aren't lining up well on the date and time that we gave.
Yeah, definitely. And that's like a good general recommendation. I've been keeping an eye on that a lot more in the last several months. And so you'll actually see in some of my notes, like, if this doesn't work for you, use the day earlier around the same time and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Are there any close time zone ones on this one that you recall?
There are some, not like crazy close, but yeah, there's some that could be, in which case I noted that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you ready to get into it?
Yeah. So June 1st is the first election of the month. And this is probably the best one, I would say. I mean, they all have nice attributes, but yeah, this is a really nice one. So June 1st, around 4:31 a.m., I guess that's the only not nice thing about it, is you have to get up very early or stay up very late for it. So it's going to be a Taurus rising chart with about 20 degrees of Taurus rising. And Venus is ruling the ascendant and is placed in its own sign of Taurus, as we discussed. It's right on the ascendant degree in this chart, in a night chart, so it's the best planet in the chart, right on the ascendant. The moon is also exalted in Taurus and in the first house, and it's applying to a conjunction with Venus, and also has reception since Venus rules the moon's sign.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really nice. The specific time was chosen just to, I mean, here, you might not be able to do this exactly where you are, but see what happens. Because Venus is on the ascendant then, but I moved it like a couple minutes so that the midheaven would move just slightly into Aquarius, so it wouldn't be with Saturn in a night chart. So the midheaven's going to be in different places, in different locations, so see where that falls for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's really going to be highly dependent on location. I
Hmm.
mean, so some people are going to run into an issue where if they have Taurus rising, it may put Saturn like right on the midheaven.
Yeah. I mean, well, although, you can definitely at least make sure that Saturn isn't on like the degree of the midheaven or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Well,
Yeah.
that should be the main directive then for
Hmm.
this election is do pretty much any degree of Taurus rising, but make sure that Saturn is not on the degree of the midheaven.
Sure. Yeah. And then in your location, if you can have it so that, Saturn is away from the midheaven and Venus is also near the ascendant, that's even better.
Yeah, put Venus and the moon as close to the ascendant as you can.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
Okay. So, basically, yeah, the ninth house isn't great here just because Saturn's in a night chart in the ninth. So long distance travel is not the best use for this chart. This would be really good, I would say, for just general Venusian type of elections. And so, kind of unifying relationships between people, things involving beauty or art, all of those good Venus type of significations this would be a great chart for that.
Right, definitely.
Yeah. And money's not bad too, because the sun and Mercury in its own sign are in the second. The sun's applying to Jupiter in the eighth house, the other financial house of shared resources.
Separating.
The sun is applying to
Oh, you're talking
Jupiter.
about the sun. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought you're talking about the ruler of the second Mercury.
No. So Mercury is separating, but it's still at least in Gemini, whereas that's not going to be the case for most of the month. So
Okay.
it's still better. You will see, it's still better than it will be. And then the sun is in the second applying to Jupiter. So all in all, this is one of the better charts for finances as well this month.
Okay. What is it not good for?
The ninth, as I mentioned. So long distance travel and higher education.
Okay. We have Mars in the third, but it's a day chart, and the ruler of the third's well placed. It is a waning moon instead of waxing.
Yeah, it is balsamic. Yeah, I did write that in the notes actually. So that's kind of its only major issue. Is that all other factors being equal, a waxing moon is usually preferable, whereas a waning moon is more like trying to wind things down or bring something to completion. But you can still start things with a balsamic moon, especially if the chart is otherwise positive, which this one is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. That looks pretty good. So this is the main election of the month.
This is the first one. This one also does have a couple of these early ones have alternate rising signs just to make the most of the good elections in the beginning of the month, or if you need to use it for a different topic or something. So the alternate rising sign would be around 11:18 a.m. with about 24 degrees of Leo rising. And let me pull that up as well here. Yeah, so basically, and some of these are also like if this works in your location and so forth. But this is Leo rising with the sun ruling the ascendant placed in the 11th house in Gemini. And it is applying, as we mentioned with the last chart, to Jupiter. So the sun in the 11th this time applying to an opposition with Jupiter in the 5th house. Mercury, as the ruler of the sun, is still at least in the sign of that it rules, so in Gemini. The moon Venus applying conjunction is now in the 10th house of career and kind of public reputation and things like that. So this one is probably, it's going to bring out more of the Jupiter, although the moon Venus is very prominent because it's in the 10th house. But since this is a day chart, then the ascendant ruler applying to Jupiter is brought out. And so it's more focused on 11th house matters with the sun ruling the ascendant and placed in the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is just an alternate chart that you could use.
Yeah. What's the downside to this chart? Mars in the 12th?
Yeah, so Mars in the 12th. And I mean, again, interestingly, the 9th house isn't great here too, because of course Mars rules Aries, which is the 9th house in this chart. But yeah, 6th and 12th. So this might also not be great for like health matters, because even though the ascendant ruler, which can have to do with health, is in pretty good shape, the 6th and 12th can also be related to health, and Mars and Saturn are opposed in those houses. Also, potentially people working against your efforts, i.e. enemies, hidden enemies, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's a really good chart for friends, but there's some problems with enemies.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay,
Yeah, so those are just two things to do with that Moon Venus conjunction.
got it. That looks good.
hmm
What's next?
Next one's going to be June 3rd, just a couple days later, around 10:53 a.m. And this is another Leo rising chart. This is about 20 degrees of Leo rising. And this, so both of those were balsamic moons, and this one is going to be right after the new moon in Gemini. So you have the sun, again, ruling the ascendant, placed in the 11th in Gemini, applying to Jupiter. Now the moon is also in Gemini in the 11th with the sun and also applying to Jupiter. Those are nice, although they do square, of course, Neptune at this point in time first before they get to Jupiter. Let's see. Mercury's still in Gemini, just barely by a couple degrees. And if you do 20 degrees of Leo rising, you get Jupiter trine the ascendant and Venus a little more loosely, but still square the ascendant. So you have both the benefics angular with the ascendant.
Okay. It's interesting that it's like some of our first batch of charts with Leo rising charts during this time of the year, which is often a good time to use Leo rising while the sun is going through Taurus and Gemini.
Mm-hmm.
So you can put it in the 10th or the 11th, but this is the first batch where now Uranus is in the 10th when you do Leo rising.
It's true.
Which is kind of interesting and not necessarily bad per se, but much different energy than before.
Yeah, it does put a little more changeable energy compared to what Taurus normally is, which is usually more like stable and earthy. And it still is that, but it has some twist to it.
Yeah, well, it reminds me also I used a Taurus rising chart, a Leo rising chart with the sun in Gemini for the Denver astrology group.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that. We've been doing those episodes more of like recording those and like releasing it publicly using all the technology and stuff.
That's a good point.
It's kind of interesting because it's brought more sort of publicity to the group. And we've had more people attending now suddenly who didn't know about it or weren't attending before through recording the Uranus and Taurus episode.
Right.
So that's a funny, interesting sort of electional thing in and of itself, having the chart of the group respond in that way.
That's true. And so that brings in, the point where like this could also involve technology in some fashion in career matters.
Right. All right. Anything else about this chart?
I mean, it's quite similar to the last Leo rising chart. It's just that now the moon is in Gemini applying to Jupiter instead of in Taurus applying to Venus.
I mean, the only thing I do notice is that the sun and the moon both have to make it through Neptune first before getting to Jupiter.
Yeah.
And that's an issue we've run into with elections with like outer planets and like how much to avoid them as complete deal breakers versus as maybe negotiable things as long as it's broadly still applying to a benefic.
Right. Yeah, well, and it often comes down to like what your options are. So for June, for instance, I've just preferred to ignore Neptune. I mean, I say that half jokingly, but it's just like there's still better charts than the other options. So, but that said, I mean, Neptune, of course, has to be involved somehow because it is there, and they will hit Neptune before Jupiter because Neptune and Jupiter are very close in degree for a couple months here.
Right. I guess I would just warn people that possible issues surrounding deception, surrounding money or financial matters is something you may want to be careful about with this chart.
Yeah, especially shared finances. Although it's nice that at least Jupiter still rules the 8th, even though Neptune is in the 8th.
Sure.
So it helps. Yeah.
Okay. What's next?
All right. So the one after that is going to be June 7th. And that's going to be a later chart in the day, 7:18 p.m. approximately. So this is going to be a Sagittarius rising chart. And there are going to be a lot of Sag rising charts for the rest of the month here. So around 7:18 p.m. is 4 degrees of Sagittarius rising. And pull that up on my screen. Okay, so Jupiter in its own sign of Sagittarius in a day chart in the first house, so really strong ascendant ruler, even though Jupiter is still retrograde at this time, but otherwise very strong ascendant ruler. The moon is in Leo in the ninth house, and it's applying via trine to Jupiter, and then after that, it will go on to square Venus. And the sun is in the seventh house in Gemini, and it is applying via opposition to Jupiter. And the moon is kind of accentuating that sun-Jupiter application because it's just barely separating from the sun and then applying to Jupiter. The moon also has reception in that sextile, which is kind of nice, an added bonus. You'll notice that Mars-Saturn is getting closer now, the opposition, so it's about 4 and change degrees applying.
Right, and this is the first of the charts where Mercury's not in Gemini anymore.
Exactly. So you can see that switches things a lot because, even though Mercury wasn't applying to Jupiter in the beginning of this month, it was at least still in its own sign. Now it's in Cancer and applying to Mars.
Right.
So it does, unfortunately, also make the seventh house, the sun applying to Jupiter by itself is good, but then the seventh house ruler is Mercury applying to Mars. So there's a bit of a counteraction in a negative fashion there going on.
Right. And it's interesting that the eighth house is bad with Mars there, but then the ruler is the moon, which is so well placed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag here. But at least, you do have a really strong ascendant ruler and you have a nice moon-Jupiter application. So there are those things.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of those instances where the financial indicators are good, but then afflicted, where the Saturn is the ruler of the second, and it's well placed by sign. It's in its own sign in the second in a day chart, which would otherwise be okay, but then it's opposed by Mars through an applying opposition from the eighth in a day chart.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not a good chart for financial matters.
No, and that's another reason why I actually threw in the alternate rising signs in the beginning of the month here, because Sagittarius rising for most of the month is just crap for finances. The ascendant ruler is great, but then the second and eighth are not. Mm-hmm. Just because of where Saturn and Mars are falling, and they're going to fall that way all month. So that's why I would try to throw in a few other rising signs in case people needed to do financial focused matters.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do try to keep the sun above the descendant angle so that it stays a day chart and is most positive since Jupiter's ruling the ascendant.
So don't let the sun set.
Yeah, do it before sunset.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And in this location, Jupiter happens to be squaring the midheaven. That may not be the case where you are, but it was just as well because then it was going to be an early ascendant degree, and so it stays a day chart, and that's kind of the more important thing.
Okay.
Yep. So there's that. I do have an alternate rising sign for this one as well.
Okay.
So it's going to be basically early the next morning around 4:05 a.m. So it's one more Taurus rising chart. About 21 degrees of Taurus rising. And
wait, what day?
It would be June 8th, so just overnight. So technically June 8th, 4:05 a.m. So about 21 degrees of Taurus rising. Venus is in the last degree of Taurus in the first house. I don't usually like to put the ascendant ruler in the last degree because it can supposedly indicate some circumstances potentially changing soon after the election. But nonetheless, this was still kind of like the other thing talking about Neptune. It's still, what are the best options amongst all of them this month? So here is another option that didn't have the second eighth quite as badly placed. So Venus in a night chart in the first house before it changes signs. Moon is in Leo in the fourth house. And the moon is actually enclosed by benefics in this chart because it's now done with that trine to Jupiter. It's separating from Jupiter and now applying directly to a square with Venus, which is, of course, the better benefic at night. So the moon application is, again, very nice in this one.
Mm-hmm.
Sun is still applying to Jupiter. Sun's in the second house in this chart, applying to Jupiter in the eighth. So, even though you still have a mixed bag because Mercury is ruling the second and then it's mixed up with Mars and Saturn, at least it's not like the malefics themselves straight across the second and eighth.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, and because this is a night chart, things switch. So Mars is not the greater malefic, but instead Saturn becomes the more difficult malefic.
Exactly. So Saturn is in the ninth. So again, with the Taurus rising charts, you don't want to use them for higher education or long distance travel. Those are kind of the main things to stay away from with the Taurus rising charts.
Yeah, although it's interesting because Mars is still applying to Saturn, now Mars is the one that's getting afflicted by Saturn rather than the other way around.
Exactly.
Which is not that great for 7th house stuff since Mars is the ruler of the 7th here.
For sure. I would agree.
Okay.
And potentially, I don't know, things with education in general, just because the 3rd and the 9th both have to do with that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Any other observations on this one?
Nope.
Okay.
What's next?
All right. So after that, then we jump ahead. And this is why, so I give 3 charts later in the month. We kind of skip mid-June because that's the huge exact pile up with Mars, Saturn, Mercury.
So first, the epicenter is like Mars opposing Saturn on the 14th and 15th, and then Mercury catching up, opposing Saturn on the 16th, and then hitting Mars around the 18th, 19th.
Yeah. So that whole span is just kind of not great for those things.
Okay.
And it's tough because even if you go to Senate ruler, which if if any listeners look through the middle of June for possibilities, there are some, but it's still like you're baking in those really tough aspects somewhere in the chart. Yeah. So I decided to skip ahead. So these 3 are going to be near the end of the month. The first one's June 20th. And that's going to be around 6:43 p.m. and which is 7 degrees of Sagittarius rising. And pull it up here. Okay. So, and you'll see some of the differences here, but so ascendant Sagittarius, Jupiter ruling it in the 1st in a day chart. The sun is still just barely in Gemini in the 7th. It's in the last degree of Gemini. Venus is in the 7th house in Gemini as well, applying fairly closely within a few degrees to an opposition with Jupiter. The moon in this chart is getting close-ish to mid-Aquarius. It's at 11 and change Aquarius in the 3rd house, and it's applying first to a trine with Venus in the 7th, and then after that to a sextile with Jupiter in the 1st. So again, kind of bringing together that opposition there between the 1st and the 7th. You can see Mercury is just barely in the 8th house, just barely getting out of that whole pileup of Cancer-Capricorn oppositions. So Mercury is at like 24 degrees of Cancer, just kind of pulling away by a degree its conjunction with Mars.
Right.
Yeah, so that's definitely the downside.
Yeah, it's just still so close to all that.
It's really close. So I really, if people are listening to this ahead of time, I would definitely prioritize the early June elections. These are, these have more clear problems with them, although they're still decent in other ways. And so these are more for like if you need to do something later in the month, because of course not everyone can do everything they need to do, they want to use an election for in the 1st week of June. So, yeah.
Right.
So just pointing that out, I did notice that, but nonetheless.
Yeah, this is not the time, I don't think. Actually, I should check and see if it's the time, but this is my chart for like leaving and flying back home from the UK.
Right.
So it's like the first one I could come up with.
Right, where Mercury is just barely separating.
Yeah, it's separating by a degree at this point.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so the only other thing to mention, I guess, about this one is, actually a couple of things. So let me pull, sorry. Okay, so Neptune is stationary at this point. So it will be more of a focal point. It's in the 4th house there. So there could be, something nebulous surrounding like home and family matters at this time. Jupiter's fairly closely square Neptune at this point. It's in the same degree. So it is emphasizing the Neptune a little bit more than it would be otherwise. And then with these last 3 charts, I had some issues with deciding on exact degrees. And I think actually, I wonder if I think I might have switched this one. Well, if you can, so you have an option between putting Jupiter on the ascendant, which is the case. Yeah, I think I actually saved a different picture version. That's what's throwing me off here. Okay, so you can either put Jupiter right on the ascendant, or you can choose to mitigate Mercury a little bit by putting it sextile the midheaven in late Virgo, if that's an option in your location, since Mercury does still rule the Sun and Venus in this chart, and it's in the 8th house.
Okay.
Yeah. So those are your two kind of options for dealing with the exact time. And then all of Sagittarius rising virtually will be a day chart at this point, since the Sun's at 29.5 Gemini.
Right.
Yeah. So you don't have to worry about that.
Okay.
Okay, so that's that one. Again, financial matters with any of these Sagittarius rising charts are just not great, with the Saturn, Pluto, Mars opposition.
Yeah, if you need a financial chart, definitely stick with earlier in the month.
Earlier in the month, yeah, for sure. Okay, so any other comments on this one?
Nope.
All right, so the next one's going to be June 23rd. And this one is around 6:42 p.m., which is about 9 degrees of Sagittarius rising. And so again, same first house going on. Venus is still in the 7th house in Gemini, although it's slightly past its exact aspect with Jupiter, but still close. The Sun's moved on, and it's in Cancer now with Mars and Mercury. The moon is in about mid-Pisces in the 4th house, and it's applying by square to Jupiter with reception, since Jupiter rules Pisces. And then it'll go on to sextile Saturn and square Venus. So this is a nice Moon-Jupiter election, although clearly you still got all that Cancer pileup going on. Mercury is now about 3 degrees separating from Mars, a little bit more. And then I did have a note that if the aspect has already started separating where you are, you can probably do one day earlier around the same time with Moon in earlier Pisces, since this is a really close applying aspect here.
Yeah. Yeah, it might be too close for some of the people west of Denver.
Right. And again, this is Mercury sextile the midheaven, since it is, otherwise in the 8th house and with Mars and Saturn.
So the main thing about this election is just having Sagittarius rising, but then mitigating Mercury somehow at the midheaven?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And then just making sure that the moon is still applying to Jupiter where you are, and if not, doing it a day earlier.
Okay. Got it.
All right, so there's that one. And then finally, the last one, is going to be June 29th, almost at the end of the month. And that is around 5:40 p.m. It's about 2 degrees of Sagittarius rising. And so again, it's really similar things in terms of the first house, Jupiter there in a day chart in the first, ruling the ascendant. The moon is in very early Gemini in this chart in the 7th house, and it's applying
What day again?
This is going to be June 29th.
Okay.
Yeah. And the moon is in very early Gemini in the 7th house with Venus, and opposed to Jupiter. The moon is applying via sextile to Mercury in the 9th house, with reception, since Mercury rules the moon. And and then you have both Jupiter and Venus angular. Mercury is finally at least separating out of the same sign. It's still within about 3-4 degrees of Mars, but it has at least moved into the next sign, although it will slow down in retrograde in July. But there's that.
Right.
Yeah. But at least for now, it's not, right next to Mars, although close. Yeah. And let's see, any other notes about that? At the exact election time, Mercury is also trine the ascendant here. And if you can't get the moon applying to Mercury, it's fine, because it'll still go on to apply to Jupiter and Venus. So it'll still be in, good condition. It's just that since that worked here, I just chose to do the moon Mercury.
Okay.
So again, downsides are going to be 2nd and 8th houses, since Mars and Saturn are there, although Mars is separating by a decent bit by this point in the month, about 11-ish degrees.
Right.
Yeah.
That's good for Saturn.
Yeah, it's good for Saturn. I mean, the sun is now, of course, applying to an opposition with Saturn, although it still has about 10 degrees to go here.
Okay.
Yeah. And then Jupiter's square the midheaven here, although depending on what you do with your exact time, that may not be the same in your location.
Yeah, so what do they need to aim for in terms of the ascendant and midheaven, whatever the location in general?
I mean, for the most part, any degree of Sagittarius rising is going to be pretty good here. The specifics as far as exact time, you can aim for Jupiter square the midheaven if you want, or, aspecting the midheaven in some fashion, not necessarily square. If you can still get the moon applying to Mercury where you are, that's kind of nice to aim for. But again, it's totally fine if your degree of, if Sagittarius rising where you are won't do that, it's fine because it'll still go on to apply to Jupiter and Venus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anything else about this chart?
My only real reservation, this otherwise looks like a decent chart to me, but since I happen to know that Mercury is slowing down at this point, and is going to retrograde fairly soon, that's kind of my only reservation with using this for like something that's going to be like a really long-term venture as opposed to like a medium-term venture or something.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's so focal since, Mercury's ruling the moon and Venus. Yeah, so that's kind of my only reservation. Really, my recommendations for this month would be to just focus the most on using the early June charts. And these are kind of like, second tier backups, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, from the 20th forward, Mercury's in its shadow, and definitely by the very end of the month, it's very close to stationing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just hovering around Mars that whole time, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those ones at the end of the month are almost a little nice in that it's free, at least by sign, and has a few degrees off of Mars, which it didn't have closer to the 20th.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was kind of liking that too.
Okay. All right. Any other charts?
Nope, that is the very end. And then next month we get to deal with Mercury retrograde most of the month.
Most of the month?
Yeah. So about a week into July it goes retrograde.
You've already started looking at that?
I mean, I just happened to notice, yeah. Because I knew that it was going to go retrograde conjoined Mars. And so when I started looking near the end of June, I was like, oh yeah, we're getting into that.
Yeah. I wonder if there'll be anything good later in the month.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to station at 23, which means it'll run back and station kind of opposing Saturn and Pluto.
That's fun.
Yeah, so that's good. But then I know things eventually start to clear up later in the summer part of in the northern hemisphere, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I remember when we were doing the year ahead, and June and July were some of the dicier times.
Oh yeah, because we get the eclipses in July, right?
Eclipses in July.
Okay, great. Very good. All right. I guess that's it.
Yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, just focus your efforts in early June if you can. If you can't, here are some that are still pretty decent. And yeah, write us and let us know what you're doing with these elections and how they turn out.
Yeah, we would love to hear from you guys. Hopefully we gave you some good pointers for adjusting the time and usually moving it forward a day if the time that we gave you is not working out for a specific chart.
Mm-hmm.
So let us know if you need any clarification on that. But otherwise, good luck with your elections this month, and we'll be back again next month for the elections for July.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool.
All right.
Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Thanks to Leisa for finding the elections this month, and we'll see you again in a few weeks.
All right. See you next time.